Hello and welcome to the old Fliers. The discovery of a 1927 Avro Avian aircraft under a house in Brisbane set pilot and adventurer Lang Kidby thinking about Queenslander Bert Hinkler's fabulous 1928 flight in an Avian. Hinkler had been the first man to fly solo the 14,000 miles from England to Australia in an Avian G-EBOV. Bert's story is told by Peter Gall in this excellent video. Bert Hinkler was chief test pilot for Avro aircraft, and he would be sorely tested as pilot, navigator and mechanic on a solo flight of this magnitude. Captain Frederick Jacques had imported uniform Foxtrot Zulu brand new into Australia in 1927 and used her on many pioneering runs around South Australia and Western New South Wales. Bert Hinkler would have test flown this and all avians shipped to Australia. In the mid-1930s, UFZ was owned by the Maryborough Aero Club, who on sold to 18-year-old Harold Kenny in 1940. He flew it unregistered to Toowoomba. On his way there, he saw a couple of fishermen on Bribie Island north of Brisbane and did an impromptu beat-up. One of the fishermen was Queensland's only civil aviation airworthiness inspector. Naturally, Harold was charged not with flying an unregistered aircraft, but for using his motorcycle fuel ration to do so. It was wartime. Harold became chief flying instructor at the Royal Queensland Aero Club. His Avian fell into disrepair when he could not afford an engine rebuild, and it was deregistered and shoved into a hangar in Archerfield in 1946. An enthusiast took it from there to store under his house in Brisbane, where it stayed in very bad shape until bought by Lang Kidby. Complete stripping and restoration of the Avian took 12 months at Caboolture Airfield in Queensland in 1997-1998. Coincidentally, Bert Hinkler was born in Bundaberg, just 300 kilometres north of Caboolture. Sponsorship for this reenactment would be crucial to the project's success. It was Kingsford-Smith who said in 1928 that finding sponsorship is like selling stinking fish. Kidby then had to get approval from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Donald Douglas said that when he was building the DC-3, when the weight of paperwork equals the weight of the aircraft, it will fly. Finally, in May 1998, the Avian, carrying its original 1928 registration VH-UFZ, flew for the first time in 50 years, the last airworthy aircraft of its type in the world. Within days, the Avian was in the hold of a Martinair 747, winging its way to Schiphol Airport before being flown from there across to England. There in England and Ireland, the Avian was displayed at 10 air shows who had booked this outstanding example of British Commonwealth aviation history. Then, with 8 weeks before departure for Australia, disaster struck. The beautiful aircraft was almost totally destroyed in a landing accident. Cox Insurance, the only large sponsor, decided the aircraft and project were too important to write off, so said repair. Parts of the Avian were sent to a number of the most famous aircraft restorers in the UK. Lang managed to arrive at the Great Farnborough Air Show 2 days before launching from there for Australia. It was going to be quite a test flight for a newly rebuilt aeroplane. When Bert Hinkler set out across the world, most of the territory flown over was either owned or under the influence of the mighty British Empire. It is said he did not even carry a passport. On the other hand, Lang had to cross 18 independent nations, several less than cooperative. Lang's wife Beverley would follow by airlines, spending hundreds of hours on the fax and phone at her stops, trying to keep the diplomatic and overflight approvals ahead of the aircraft. The tiny Avian, fitted with extra fuel tanks, would give 12 hours endurance, still a long time to sit in a cramped and windy open cockpit. The weather nearly all the way to Australia was atrocious. Continuous rain and strong winds battered the Avian right across Europe. Dust and full-blown sandstorms endangered the flight daily across the Middle East, and hour after hour of tropical thunderstorms threatened to strip the cotton fabric from the wings through Southeast Asia. The Avian has a light wing loading and requires constant control inputs, tiring after 10 or 11 hours. Bert Hinkler experienced fine weather for much of his trip. Lang lost several days' delay chasing overflight approvals with appeals to embassies and numerous bureaucratic authorities. Dramas there were plenty, such as within 2 days of leaving, flying along the Riviera coast, he smelt fuel, and by the time Genoa arrived, the spilt fuel had soaked him to the knees, and avgas was 100 millimetres deep under his seat. 2 days after that, the main wing tank began to spray fuel over the windscreen and into the cockpit. He said, "As the fuel swirled into my eyes, I furiously operated the hand pump, hoping I could keep fuel from the long-range tanks going into the main tank faster than it was running out. I expected fire as avgas poured over the exhaust pipe, landing at Brindisi half-blinded and soaked to the waist in fuel. As I droned across 450 miles of Mediterranean Sea from Crete to Egypt at 80 knots, then down the Nile to overfly the pyramids, I thought how lonely Hinkler must have been at times. At least he didn't have to suffer the constant barrage of instructions from the Egyptian air traffic controllers. 2 dust storms over Jordan, Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea slowed the Avian to the point where cars below were overtaking me. I didn't see Bert's ghost flying alongside, but would not have been surprised if I had. The British bureaucratic legacy in India and Pakistan took its toll of my patience. Vast numbers of forms, 62 bits of paper including copies at one airport alone, meant I was spending more time at the airport than in the air each day. Over India, a large eagle impaled itself on the wires between the wings, resulting in an explosion of blood and feathers. The large body's drag caused the Avian to pull badly to the right. The intertropic conversion zone was strangely placed in 1998, with monsoons still going on in India long after the Indonesian one had started. The flight out of Calcutta over the vast mangrove delta of the Ganges River was horrendous. Hour after hour, I struggled to keep visual contact with the trees below. The torrential rain had filled the cockpit, causing me to constantly wipe my eyes. My clothes were soaked, my boots full of water, and my maps had turned to a handful of porridge. 10 hours later, upon landing at Yangon in Myanmar, I found the water had worn the leading edge of my wooden propeller completely away. Another week of constantly dodging storms down the Malaysian peninsula and a couple of thousand miles along the Indonesian island chain, I saw the brown line of the Australian coast appear on the horizon. 6 weeks of battling weather and bureaucracy, and here I was at last. Such relief to touch down in Darwin after the 450-mile Timor Sea crossing. At the front of the crowd stood Bev, who had arrived shortly before me on an airline flight. During the next month, I had the Avian constantly in the air as I exactly retraced Bert Hinkler's path from Darwin to a fabulous reception in his hometown of Bundaberg. Following the coast of Australia to Perth, we arrived on the 10th of December 1998 to be greeted with an escort of vintage aircraft from the Royal Aero Club of Jandakot and news helicopters. End of quote. Here is the broadcast on the TV from these 3 local stations.
Tonight, touchdown, the end of a historic 3-month solo flight around the world. Lang Kidby has completed his epic reenactment of Bert Hinkler's historic 1928 flight from Europe to Australia. And despite today's windy conditions, the 71-year-old biplane landed safely at Jandakot Airport for the final leg of the journey.
Landed in the last spot that Hinkler landed in. And it's a great feeling.
Lang will now return to Brisbane, where he plans a well-earned rest.
An Australian pilot has retraced the historic flight 70 years ago by Bert Hinkler. Lang Kidby touched down at Jandakot this afternoon, ending a solo flight from England to Australia.
When aviation pioneer Bert Hinkler flew solo from England to Australia, he was the first, broke several records along the way. 70 years later, Lang Kidby's retraced his flight. 3 months ago, Lang Kidby left England. He was escorted into Jandakot by a flight of tiger moths. Back in 1927, Bert Hinkler was the test pilot who first flew this aeroplane. Now the last in the world, it's repeated his solo flight across the globe. First order of business, a kiss for Lang from his wife Bev, who's followed his journey from the comfort of a succession of commercial jetliners.
So, Lang, the end of a very long journey. Oh, yeah, certainly is. This is just a marvellous welcome here.
Like Bert Hinkler, Lang's first Australian landing was at Darwin, then around the eastern seaboard to end here in the west.
This is the best because we know it is the end. We've completed everything we set out to do. Landed in the last spot that Hinkler landed in.
Alan Buterac, 7 Nightly News.
The final leg of an epic journey. Australian pilot Lang Kidby escorted into Perth. His solo flight from the UK now complete. The Brisbane grandfather retraced the steps of Bert Hinkler, the first pilot to fly solo in a light aircraft from Europe to Australia back in 1928.
This is the best because we know it is the end. We've completed everything we set out to do. Landed in the last spot that Hinkler landed in. And it's a great feeling.
The aviator restored the Avro Avian last year, and 18 countries and 200 flying hours later, the very last of the historic crafts is up for sale.
So it's the last one flying. It's been in Australia for 71 years. Has a tremendous Australian history, so I'm now the world's only Avro Avian salesman, so we've got to keep this aircraft here.
In the welcoming party, one of the Avian's original engineers, at 89, reminiscent of the old days.
Well, I mean, I'm an old bloke, so I've seen a lot of aeroplane work, and not too many have had that privilege, you know. I've been lucky.
The 51-year-old's next journey, a return trip to Brisbane for Christmas. Mignon Henny, 10 News.
This was to be Lang's 4th trip in antique aeroplanes over this route in 8 years. In 1994, he flew a replica Vickers Vimy from England to Australia, reenacting the Smith brothers' record-breaking 1990 flight, the first ever from England to Australia. That is the subject of our second video. Thank you for watching. Hit the like and subscribe button to encourage new content.